Our next guest is an author, journalist, educator, and host of a popular podcast, Work Appropriate. Please welcome Helen Petersen to the South by Southwest EDU studio. Hi, Ann.
Hi.
Okay, so I know that you're here at South by Southwest EDU for a live episode of your popular podcast and Work Appropriate.
Yeah.
And the topic is your workplace is not your family.
Yeah.
So please expand on that and tell me, how can that be used by schools and universities as well?
Well, that phrase, this place is like a family, right? I think a lot of people have heard that in their lives, especially people who work in any sort of passion job.
Yes.
So that we're talking about nonprofits, but we're especially talking about schools and educatory institutions. And I think that that's something, smaller schools, especially, like, we're all working together to be like a family. Sometimes we forget that families are often very dysfunctional, right? And families can ask things of each other that are not necessarily appropriate for the workplace. And so I think one of the things that we're going to be talking about in this episode, we get quandaries from listeners who write in with problems with, in this case, workplaces that are trying to use that refrain, we're like a family, to get away with toxic or bad behavior. So how can we distance ourselves from that understanding, or also work to dismantle it, because it's operative in so many different institutions.
Full disclosure, I have used that a lot because on most of my jobs, I'm like, oh, they're like my family, but
right.
I understand. So what are some of the wildest or funniest stories you've heard from listeners that bring on the inappropriate?
Yeah. I mean, like, so on the gross level, and this, I think, actually is connected to treating your workplace like your family. Is people, I cannot tell you how many stories I have of people who cut their fingernails or their toenails in the office. And that's not what you maybe automatically think of when you think of treating your workplace like a family, but It is a sense of intimacy or over-intimacy that, like, I can do whatever I want in this office. And I think, like, this is a spectrum, right? We don't want people to be so uptight that they feel like they can't be themselves in any way. But also, and it's usually men who are clipping their fingernails in the office.
I'm sorry, I would never clip my fingernails, like, in the living room in front of my parents. So,
and we're talking, like, in conference rooms, in meetings, in open offices where, like, maybe you have a tiny bit of a divider, but it's just, or actually a teacher told me about, they inherited a desk from a previous teacher, and they opened up the drawer, and it was filled with fingernail clippings.
Oh my God! Oh,
so that's the the abject side of the story. But we're also talking about, we don't have enough money. We all need to come together. We need to bootstrap this as a family, when really something probably is going on in the organization that is making the project unsustainable. You don't have enough labor, you don't have enough time, enough resources to make it happen. And if you rely on that refrain of we're like a family, you oftentimes end up in these really exploitative situations. So.
Okay, I can't get rid of that visual. That is a horror
Everyone else
show.
gets it in their head now too.
Yeah, seriously. And I just want to know the motivation. Why are we saving our fingernail clippings? Let's go on. Okay, so here in Texas, there are now 44 different school districts that are moving or have moved to a 4-day school week. This is citing teacher retention, teacher burnout as one of the driving factors behind this decision.
Yeah.
But how do you envision the school workplace changing in years to come?
Well, I love that, bringing up the idea of a 4-day work week. This is something that is in place where I'm from in Idaho, oftentimes as a money-saving tactic, because you don't have to pay for the electricity on that Friday. And that's not necessarily, I think that might help here, right? But it's not necessarily the motivation here. I think the 4-day week, what it does, and some teachers who had different schedules during the pandemic really had a taste of this, was, okay, what if we actually make time for prep in our work week? Instead of saying prep is going to be anytime that you're not in the school. Like, you need to do all of this other work for your work week outside of school hours. And that's where you get into these burnout scenarios, because you have no space for recuperation, no space for recovery, and you get into this place of, like, I am going full stop all of the time and no break at all. So if you build in that day or that time, right? Like, a lot of schools across the nation, they had time built in for cleaning during the pandemic. And with that time, it's not as if like most teachers were, I don't know, going off and surfing or something like that. They were doing the work that they needed to do to be prepared for their class. And then you enter the classroom feeling more prepared. It's just great. And so I think like, I understand the resistance to treat education as a business model or to treat it as an office, but sometimes there are lessons that can really be applied from the office world that make the educational situation just a better run and a more thoughtful place for people to work. Because you're an employee. Just because you're a teacher doesn't mean you're not an employee.
And prep is part of the work.
Yes, 100%.
You should be paid for working.
Yes.
So you think a 4-day work week is actually a good thing?
Oh, I love 4-day work week. Like I think they are revelatory. They increase productivity. They increase retention. They make it so that people are more creative, right? Because they're not in this perpetual burnout cycle. You're a better teacher when you're not constantly exhausted.
But at the same time, with a 4-day school week,
Yep.
you're starting earlier and you're ending later.
Yeah.
And I've seen that most studies are saying that
That's not a good idea.
older kids especially have a different time clock with their circadian rhythms. And so like getting there earlier is actually going to make them burn out faster.
Yeah.
And burnt out kids, we know, make burnt out teachers.
And also make burnout adults when they grow up because you learn these strategies early on. This is where I think you can't just say, we're going to do, some workplaces do this as well. We're going to do 4 10s. We're going to do 4 10-hour days. So we're going to do the same amount of hours that we expect you to be there. It's just going to be over 4 days. That's a burnout factory, right? The actual principles of the 4-day work week, which have been implemented all over the globe really successfully, is not we're going to move those Friday hours and tack them on to the rest of the day. It's we're going to just have 4 days.
Yes.
And because the teachers and the students are going to be less burnt out, you're going to get all of that learning in that you would have otherwise. This does mean that we have to come up with solutions for where do kids go on Fridays? And, at the schools that I was talking about out in the Mountain West, like the school is still open. It's a different set of staff that are there, and it's a place where they can go to work on homework. Like it's almost like an after-school program, but it's on Fridays, so that you don't have to worry about care scenarios because most parents aren't also on a 4-day week. But that, I think, is crucial. We're not just like the long-term solution is not just funneling those days into the other days of the week. It's actually decreasing the amount of hours that everyone works, including the students.
Yeah.
And that can mean, actually, that kids learn more, teachers teach better, but that's something that I think is really hard to get into our brains.
Right. You think that more hours mean better learning.
Yes.
But it's not necessarily that case. Okay. So what are you hearing from teachers, higher ed professors, as well as business professionals? How are folks handling the post-pandemic transition back into the classroom?
Well, I think that most teachers have been back long enough that, we're not in that weird space. And this is true, I think, for business professionals, too, of like, are we going to be called back again? Like, we had those periods of different strains of COVID where people are like, okay, I guess we're back home again. And it was hard to get any sort of rhythm into place. What I see now is the teachers they're like, okay, I'm going to come back and I'm going to give it a try. And now they're either leaving or they're going to stay, right? They've reached that pivot point and are looking for opportunities outside of education or maybe just outside of the classroom. Maybe the classroom itself is unsustainable and they still want to be in education. So what I see a lot of is people looking for new careers or new pathways from their career. And how can we figure that out? How can we also think about how, if we have all of these teachers leaving, how are we going to recruit new educators? I'm going to convince them that this is the job that they want to stay in.
I mean, I feel like a 4-day week that's just those hours plus summers off is a pretty good deal. I would do that.
Yeah.
If it actually came down to that.
Yeah.
You're a keen observer of societies and professions. How would you describe the state of teaching today? Any trends or themes you're picking up here at South by Southwest EDU?
Well, I think that there is a real eagerness to figure out how to actually implement inclusive styles of education, right? That means in terms of neurodiversity, in terms of disability, in terms of like, how do we figure out a DEI strategy that is inclusive of other teachers, and also we can teach in a way that is gesturing towards the whole breadth of our students' experience as well. It's difficult. within the political climate, and I think that that is changing every day, right? Like, what is the new obstacle that's going to make our jobs harder from people who don't know what we're doing in the classroom? So that's a real struggle, and I think that that actually connects with the other strain that I see, maybe not so much here, but just overall, is this idea of demoralization, which is different than burnout, right? Like burnout, you can come back from burnout. Demoralization is this idea, I do not have the tools to do my job in a way that feels ethically right. So.
Give me an example of that.
I do not have the ability to teach my students I don't have the resources. I do not have enough books. I do not have the ability my students who have specialized education plans do not have the staff to actually work with those kids. I'm doing a bad job at my job every day. And that leads to demoralization because it's that idea, I could work my butt off and I still couldn't do my job the way that I need to. How do you change that? It has to be structural. And so I always, at a conference like this one, I am always really heartened to see people who are trying to think about these structural changes. Because you can work on the margins, you can try to think about okay, what if I try this lesson plan? What if I'm mindful of this? But a lot of these changes really demand us rethinking the place of education in our everyday lives. And you need to have people with that energy to really push that forward, even when it seems hard.
It's a hard job. You have to be driven, you have to be inspired, and you have to have some sort of delight in what you do. It's sometimes very thankless. So I imagine the demoralization of teachers is the saddest thing I've ever heard you say.
No, I think it's really hard to come to terms with. And I talk to a lot of teachers who are in that place and who are sad about it. They're like, I thought this was my life's work. I love my kids. I love teaching, but there isn't a path forward for me. So how do we reopen that path? That's what we have to think about.
So I'm going to ask you some specific situation at work or school, universities, how to handle these situations. So I'm just copying you on your podcast. So starting off, how do we best deal with boss and coworker who can't stop talking about their love life?
I mean, this is just a classic boundaries, and also relates to the whole workplace as your family. It's an inappropriate relationship between supervisor and managee, and probably the person who's getting managed is how do I say this in a way that doesn't make my manager feel weird or make them take it out on me subconsciously? And I think one way I have seen, and one way, I have a different co-host on my show every week who helps give us advice. And one of the pieces of advice that I've heard various ones of them give is, how do you actually make this into okay, we're going to take this conversation that is not about work. Let's save it for Fridays. Let's have that be our lunch conversation. Because right now, I'm trying to focus on work. Sometimes I feel I get off focus because I get so interested in the stories that you're telling. You kind of flatter them a little bit with
okay,
this is interesting. And
flatter and pivot.
Yeah, and then you say, Ben, let's move those conversations over to this other time. And maybe eventually you stop having that Friday lunch, but at least in the beginning, that's, I think, the best course to go, especially if it's your man. It's someone who has power over you.
Yeah, that's difficult.
Yeah.
So, hey, you know what, can we meet for Friday and talk about this? Oh, so let's get back to blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Kind of like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't wait to hear more about this on Friday. Let's have a lunch where it's just where we just debrief on
Full
this.
download.
Right.
Okay. Just notes. What about workers who bring partisan politics to work? That's a toughie.
100%. And I mean, I think that you have to work with people who have different political views from you most of the time. Some people have the privilege of only working with the people who are absolutely aligned with them in every sort of way, but most of us have to work with people who have different perspectives, experiences than us. I think when someone says something in relation to a political perspective that is racist, bigoted, transphobic in some sort of way, you can call that out, and I think that's appropriate, and there's a way to do it that's not I got you, right? Just say this makes me feel really uncomfortable when you say that. Could you please not say that publicly, right? So no tolerance in that level. And I think there's also a place with those sorts of comments where you can talk to an HR department or to a manager about it. But then the more I think trying to keep things at an even simmer way is, you and I have different politics, and that's okay. I'd rather not talk about that right now.
Yeah,
right?
no, that's a good way.
Just like you can acknowledge, I think you don't have to pretend like you share their politics in any way. But if they're just saying something about a political figure who they like, right, it's not something that is discriminatory or offensive. You can just say, hey, we've got different politics. I'd like to still be friends with you in the office. What if we don't talk about that here?
I think that works for family as well.
Yes.
So legit. What about the person who eats smelly food at their desk? Say broccoli in the microwave, fish.
I mean, this is hard too, because I think sometimes this, like the standards of what is quote unquote smelly, it's like, many white Americans in particular, like the only thing that's not smelly in the workplace is like mashed potatoes and I don't know, some meat. But like some people, if you're a vegetarian, maybe the smell of meat is really hard for you to deal with. There are all sorts of things that, depending on your perspective, might be offensive.
So what do you do?
So what do you do? If it's egregious and constant, like someone making popcorn every single day at 3 p.m., right? Talk to HR. This is an HR thing. I think that anytime that you try to make it into an interpersonal thing, especially if you are on the same level of power within the organization, it's going to be kind of awkward unless you're friends with them and you can kind of joke with them and be like, dude, the fish again, right? Like that's a situation where you can kind of, I think, have a nice conversation, but otherwise take it above your pay grade because you are not the only person in the office who feels this way. And this is true with someone who wears strong cologne, someone who is clipping their toenails in the office. Like that's a conversation with HR.
Okay, so you're also doing a book signing for your latest book, Out of the Office, a deep dive into working from home. What's your inspiration for writing the book? I mean, was it pandemic?
Yeah. No, I started writing the book like 6 months into the pandemic, and I had been working from home for a long time. So before I was a journalist, I was an academic. Academics work from home a lot, like professors, you go into the office sometimes, but you really have a lot of control over the flexibility of your schedule. And then also, I had worked in New York for BuzzFeed News and moved to Montana, still working, but remotely. And I knew at that point when the pandemic started, like there are all these people who are doing this for the first time. And it is so easy when you can work anytime to work all the time. No, all the time.
Okay, that was different than me.
I think it depends on what kind of work you're doing, right? And especially in the beginning of the pandemic, I think a lot of people were very nervous about losing your job. And so you come up with these work habits of like, I don't have anything else to do. Might as well do some work, right? That are pretty bad work habits. So the book.
I don't have those work habits. I'm so glad that you actually could sit down and write. That is the hardest job. Being a writer is so hard. How did you pull off that discipline?
I mean, like I was saying before, I didn't have anything else to do, so I was just like, oh, I might as well write a book. No, but really, I saw a real potential for the flexible future of the office. I don't think the future is everyone working from home all the time, right? It's depending on what type of work you do. Maybe it's 2 to 3 days in the office. Maybe it's 1 week a month in the office. It really depends on the work itself. But what that does is it opens up space so that when you are in the office, you're doing work that demands presence. You're doing that creative work, that collaborative work. You're spending time with people that feels valuable. Instead of what always happened with me, which is like, it's 5:30, I'm supposed to be here till 6. I am just scrolling Twitter. Like I'm so ready to go, but there are implicit norms that I am not supposed to leave my seat until 6. It's a waste.
That's a waste.
Total waste, right?
Yes.
And then when you're at home, you're also trying to be mindful about like, I get to move my schedule around to make it work the way that I want. Maybe I can take a walk at lunch. Maybe I can, like right now I pick up my friends' kids at 2 p.m. every Tuesday and Thursday and wedge that and we hang out for 2 hours. Like that's something that I move into my day. I'm able to do that sort of flexible work because of working from home. So it's just, there's a lot of opportunities there to work differently.
Yeah, you wrote a book. I learned what could be used in a Nerf gun as an edible and shot into my mouth. Cheese balls. Okay, so what are the do's and don'ts of working from home?
I think that one thing people have really lost over the course of the pandemic and even now, and that people crave, is that sort of bumper space into the workplace. So if you're going into the office now, you've regained that. But if you are any day of the week working from home, sometimes people just roll out of bed and just start working, right?
Yeah.
And what you really need is that transition, which some people have in their commute. Like, what if you had a commute, that time of a commute, but you didn't have to be in a car, use gas, be in traffic, like any of those things, right? There are different things that you can do to make that transition both into work and off of work, like the off-ramp. It could be a walk, it could be meditating, it could be yoga, it could be wrestling on the floor with your kid. Like, there's so many different things, but being really intentional about going in and out of the workplace, I think, is the big one.
I like that.
Yeah.
I still am going to learn to use cheese balls as weapons. What do you think of our offices and what do you see for like 10 or 20 years down the road? How do you see office place?
I think that the office is going to be much less of a place where people have individual desks or individual offices, and it's going to be much more of like a collaborative space. So the spaces themselves are really engineered for that in-person presence. Also, the offices are going to be engineered to make people who are not in the conference room feel as present, right? I think a lot of people have had the experience of being on a Zoom call where there are 3 people in the conference room and 3 people off of it, and
so
like
hard.
No one can hear your voice, or if like maybe your image is projected just giant on the wall and it's super weird. Like, there are great technologies already in place that make it so that that is not such an awkward experience, and so that people feel much more like they are in the same room together even when they cannot be. So that's part of it. I also think we have to figure out our communication strategies, because right now a lot of workplaces are using email and phones and texts and Slack and Zoom or Teams, right? Like, it's just like everything all the time, and also meetings all day. And things have to change. And so I think right now we're at this like oversaturation of communication technology that we're gonna have to sort that through.
I mean, can you envision a world where nobody goes actually into the physical office anymore? I mean, what would that look like?
I mean, I think that if that happens, that people are still like, sometimes the dystopic view of that is like everyone's just in their pods at home and never interacting with anyone, when in fact the reason most people I know who don't want to go into an office, the reason they don't want to go in an office is they want to be with their family or their community. They want to live where they want to live, right? A place that's affordable or near extended family members. And so there's still going to be that community, but I don't ever see a time when we're not having, especially for any sort of creative work.
And what kind of podcast would you have if we didn't go into work and have awkward situations?
I know.
So thank you so much for coming to the EDU studio. Anne, I'm so glad you got to join us today.
Thank you.
You can check out our daily schedule of interviews on our website, schedule.sxswedu.com/2023. You can also watch all of our studio interviews at the South by Southwest EDU TV app and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@SouthBySouthwestEDU. Please stay tuned for much, much more from the South by Southwest EDU studio.